GFP Commission, and yeah, today I'm just going to give a short little synopsis of some of the continental and state waterfowl breeding and population conditions. By all accounts, it's pretty good news this year. As you can see, the total continental duck population's just north of 49 million breeding waterfowl, which is up 8% from last year, and it's actually a record BPOP for the continent. So it's a heck of a good year for duck production across North America, and it's up 33% from long-term average. If you look at that long-term average graph there, you can see it's actually, we're above even the big bump in the late 90s. So we're doing really well as far as waterfowl production in the continent. And then here's just a kind of a graphical representation of the different species and how they break down across the traditional survey area in 2014. As you can see, there's a few species that really jump out at you as far as really high numbers. Gadwall, mallard's very high. American widgeon did very well this year. And for all the shoveler aficionados out there, it's actually a record northern shoveler count this year. So anybody that wants to go shoot a northern shoveler is going to have an ample opportunity. The only exceptions to the long-term average would be pintail and scaup, which are still below, but still doing very well. I mean, while they may be below long-term average, they've kind of hit a lot of folks in the waterfowl community think they've kind of hit a new kind of equilibrium population, and they're kind of bouncing along doing well. So, and if you look at the total pond count at the bottom, we're over 7 million ponds for U.S. and Canada, which is 40% above long-term average. So that's what's really driving this system is we're really wet. As far as the entire prairie pottle region and the boreal forest, we're really wet. And what everybody's really looking for isn't necessarily the BPOP, it's the fall flight. So this is just a representation of the mallard estimated fall flight. Just under 13.5 million is the estimated birds that'll be making that migration this fall from the breeding grounds to the wintering grounds. Which is what everybody wants. There's a lot of young birds out there that are easy to hunt. So the fall flights is very good. As you can see, those orange bars are just the confidence intervals around the mean. As far as specifically South Dakota ducks, we're just over 4 million breeding ducks estimated in South Dakota, which is down. And the reason for that is during the survey, which is done in early May, there were areas of South Dakota that were pretty dry. The southeast was dry. Even the northeast, some of the areas were fairly dry right at the survey time. Now, having said that, right after the survey, which as so many times happens, things changed. We got a lot of rain. So some of the early nesting species like mallard didn't settle in South Dakota in numbers that they maybe traditionally would have if it would have been wet right away. But things like blue-winged teal and gadwall and shoveler and even some scaup, some of the later nesting species, did very well. And also the birds that maybe weren't successful, the mallards and pintails and things that weren't successful right away and re-nested, have really good breeding habitat conditions now. As you can see, even this decline from 2013 is almost 70% above long-term average. So we're sitting really well for breeding waterfowl in South Dakota. Just some species breakdown. I won't go through all these numbers, but as you can see, as I said, mallard was down, and that's the settling pattern these prairie nesting ducks have. Is if there's water other places, they go there. And eastern South Dakota was basically the driest part of the prairie pottle region on a whole. So, some of those ducks did not settle. Areas in western South Dakota, however, did very well. Actually, as we go farther into the habitat conditions, you'll see that the pond number in South Dakota actually was up on a whole, and it largely was driven by West River ponds. West River was very wet at the time of the survey period. But if you look at species like pintail and blue-winged teal and even shoveler, we're up from last year. I did add green-winged teal and widgeon to the graph just to show there is a decline, but what that really is, it's an indication of the migration, because they don't really nest in South Dakota in very large numbers, but just to show you that we had more of a normal migration this year and the birds weren't stacked up during the May survey period. Last year, there was a lot of birds still stacked up during May because it was such a late spring. And if you look at the last column, long-term average, I mean, it's really phenomenal. You look at blue-winged teal and mallard and gadwall, and we're over 70% above long-term average in those three species in South Dakota, so doing very well. Divers, largely the same story. We did have a decline in redhead and scaup from last year, but most of that scaup decline is like I said, just most of the birds are breeding farther north. Canvasback was a little bit up, but if you look at the long-term average, we're still sitting really, really good for all three of those species, and continentally, those species are doing fine as a whole. A little bit about temperate breeding Canada geese in South Dakota. Some good news, the breeding index is down about 30% from last year and down 35% from the peak in 2012, which was roughly 270,000 back in 2012. So if you see that graph, the birds are coming down, and that's a positive thing with reaching more of our management objectives and hopefully alleviating some of the problems that have been associated with that.
Scotty must have stepped on a lot of eggs, huh?
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of that was, especially if you look at the strata in the southeast, we had some very dry conditions, and if you talk to any of the staff down there, there was very limited production, especially south of the interstate this year. And that's kind of, in the northeast, it wasn't necessarily that much of a decline, but production was definitely down last year as well. It was a very poor production year last year, and we're seeing some of the effects of that right now. And a little bit about the hunter number. We did lose about 11% of our active goose hunters last year, so hopefully we can rebound that this year, but at least according to our estimates. Harvest was down as well, almost 25% last year, which is kind of interesting when you think about all the liberalizations that have gone on, and harvest was still down, and a lot of that was probably due to that poor production last year. A little bit brighter note on duck hunter numbers. Specifically, we actually, can't say this very often, but we actually bumped up in duck hunter numbers last year to about 3%. So hopefully we've, if not have an increasing trend, at least stabilize that decline, which it appears we've done. And I'd sure like to see that trend begin to tick up a little bit. But if you look at the total duck harvest, we harvested just shy of 250,000 ducks last year between resident and non-resident hunters, respectively. As far as habitat conditions, I mentioned that the pond number was actually up about 30% and largely driven by West River ponds, which is great because there's still a lot of grass and landscape out West River, and that there should be a really strong breeding effort out there. Again, it's 56% above long-term average. As I mentioned earlier, we had very heavy rains in late May and June and into July in a lot of areas, which really filled ponds. If you drove around, basically anywhere east of River, South Dakota, east of Highway 25 in June, it looked like ice out in some areas because there's temporary water all over the place. Just anecdotally, myself driving around, there's duck broods everywhere on the landscape right now, so we're doing very well. The flip side to that is we're still losing a lot of grass. We're set to lose about 70,000 acres of CRP this fall in October, and in the next couple of years, we're set to lose a quarter of what's left, which would be, roughly 250,000 acres, roughly in the next 5 years, excuse me. And as has been happening for the last, 5 years especially, we've got a lot of wetland drainage still occurring in the landscape, consolidating basins, causing some potential future issues for anything that depends on wetlands in the future. Any questions?
Questions for Rocco? Now's the time to get him.
You bet.
It looks like a really good year. That's amazing that those the long-term averages are where they are for some of those species.
Yeah, it's just driven by that pond number. I mean, it's just so high that on a continental scale.